meet my bride. Let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. American history is filled with stories of people who went from rags to riches, then back to rags. And the American car industry is no exception. Many hard-working men of talent created opportunities and built automotive empires only to see them collapse and fall into ruin. Unfortunately, most of these fellows, as important as they were to the creation of the American automotive industry, are mostly forgotten today. So let's take the time to remember the man who was one of the fathers of not only the U.S. auto industry, but the U.S. roads as well, Albert Pope. Unlike most rags to riches to rags stories, this one actually begins with riches. Albert Augustus Pope was born into a large family from Boston, Massachusetts in 1843. The Popes had been in the lumber business for some 200 years and were, as a whole, very well off and respected. His father, Charles, did not continue in the family lumber business and instead went into real estate speculation. All was going well until the market crashed in 1852 and Charles lost pretty much everything. Young Albert was 9 years old and found himself plowing fields to support the family. Albert was quite industrious and with a keen mind, and soon began to garden and sell vegetables and fruits at the local farmers' market. School was not his interest, as he felt he could make good money by learning a trade, and so at age 15, he began his career as a grocer, getting his first job at a local market. He was good at it, very detailed in his work, and with an eye for making displays. He rose in the business quickly, becoming a manager and part owner by 1860. However, in 1861, the war between the states ended his grocery career. Albert joined the 35th Massachusetts Volunteer Regiment, and due to his now respected status in the community, mustered in as a second lieutenant. He served with distinction, being decorated for his bravery under fire. He left the Army as a captain, though he was given the honorary rank of lieutenant colonel by the Army afterwards. His time in service was a defining period in his life, and one that he was proud of. Indeed, he would be known as Colonel Pope for the rest of his life. He had saved up a bit of money during his time with the Union Army, so after the war he decided to use it and go into business. And he chose as his new business, shoes. Specifically supplies for cobblers and manufacturers that made shoes. He knew from experience that getting good shoes and boots to soldiers was nigh on impossible for the Army to accomplish, so he decided to fix the problem. He was very successful, and within a few years, his firm was the largest wholesale shoe supply company in the USA. It was in 1876 that the good colonel found his next passion, bicycles. He saw one for the first time at the Centennial Exposition that was held in Philadelphia and was fascinated by them. He immediately went to Europe to study them, how they were used and made, and then bought up every U.S. patent he could find regarding bikes. He hired the Weed Sewing Machine Company to make a batch of bikes for him in some spare room they had in their plant in Hartford, Connecticut. This would be the beginning of an empire. Colonel Pope's bicycles, which he called the Columbia, were a hit. They sold like crazy, and his business and advertising savvy saw his company grow quickly. He wanted to accomplish three important things in the U.S. bike world. First, bring as much of the raw manufacturing of the product in-house, even under one roof if possible. Second, bicycles at the time were very heavy. Over 70 pounds was quite common. He wanted to add lightness, as it were. And third, to get the word out about the Columbia bicycle to the world. So he bought the tire company that made the tires, the steel mill that made the frame tubing, the plating company that added the nickel to some components. I mean, you name it. Now in control of his entire supply line, he could add lightness. His were the first bikes to have hollow tube steel frames. The handlebars were also hollow. The seat was small yet comfortable, and the wheels were as light as possible. A Columbia weighed less than 25 pounds, making it the ideal racing bike, as well as comfortable for women and children due to it not being very heavy. and his posters and newspaper ad campaigns were catchy. By 1890, Colonel Pope owned the factory in Hartford, owned his entire supply chain, and was the largest bicycle manufacturer in the United States. But there was a problem. This was the USA, and there were no roads. True, you could perhaps ride a bike around town, but good luck trying to ride anything but a horse or a train from town to town. Colonel Pope understood this, which is why he promoted and sold his bikes in Europe, and they sold well there. At the same time, he began to lobby for roads in the United States. He founded the Good Roads Movement and the League of American Wheelmen in 1880, which lobbied the civil government at all levels for road reform in the United States. Colonel Pope personally and passionately believed that the U.S. federal government should create a department specifically to establish a viable road network across the nation. As early as 1893, he addressed the Congress of the United States regarding doing exactly this. In his speech, he said the following, quote, "The people everywhere throughout the country are awakening to the vast importance of better highways. The more fully realize not only the great commercial advantages of good roads, but they see more clearly that the material highways of the country are highways in a spiritual sense as well. That the growth of society, education, and Christianity depend largely upon good means of communication between home, school, and church, and that no nation can advance in civilization which does not make corresponding advance in the betterment of its highways." End quote. He and his league were tireless, influencing lawmaking regarding roads at the local and state government levels, until finally, in 1916, the Federal Aid Road Act created the first federal institution for creating roads across the U.S., the route system. This would further develop in the American government, becoming what we now know today as the U.S. Department of Transportation. So yes, the man that inspired the creation of the U.S. DOT was Colonel Pope. And by 1896, he wanted to get into the car business. His factory in Hartford, Connecticut was huge, so he converted a portion of it to make his version of a car, the Columbia Electric. He believed that since fixing U.S. roads was still going to take a long time to accomplish, electric cars were the way to go. They could be used to run whatever errands within a large town or city where there were acceptable roads, and they were quiet and thus would not spook the horses. And at first they sold well. His electric Columbia was the USA's #1 selling car in 1899, with over 2,000 cars rolling out of the factory. Colonel Pope did know Mr. William Whitney of Electric Vehicle Company in Alem fame and sold the company to him the following year. And he wanted to get into internal combustion cars, and the quickest way to do so would be to buy existing companies. He began to acquire small auto manufacturers and, using the money from his bicycle business, build them up into profitable firms. The Pope Tribune, Pope Hartford, and my personal favorite, the Pope Toledo, were amongst the dozens of car makers and component manufacturers he brought into his automotive empire. By 1904, he was a major manufacturer, with some of the most beautiful American brass-era cars being Pope's. But alas, his new automotive empire was not really making money. And at about the same time, the bicycle industry saw a downturn. By 1907, he was bankrupt, no longer able to maintain his supply chain. His competitors in the American auto world overtook him, and his companies would be absorbed into other firms by 1915. The good colonel himself passed away in 1909, being taken in and supported by extended family in Boston. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Pope had gone full circle, yet he left his mark in U.S. history as the grandfather of the roads that Americans drive on to this day. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.